Welcome to the 2020-21 webinar for the Map A. In Section 3, we will be covering Part 3, DLM Terminology and Organizational Structures, and Part 4, Instructionally Embedded Assessments. The Dynamic Learning Maps DLM is the consortium, and Missouri Assessment Program Alternate Map A is our name for the Missouri Alternate Assessment. There are two parts to this webinar. Part 3 will address DLM terminology and organizational structures. Part 4 will address instructionally embedded assessments. As you watch this webinar, feel free to pause at any time to review and reflect on the content. Finally, we will provide next steps to prepare you for Section 3. Please take a look at the graphic. Notice the terms on the graphic. In the next few slides, we will go through each term on this graphic. To understand Map A, you must understand how these terms fit together. The learning maps are a highly connected representation of how students acquire academic skills as reflected in research. The learning maps go beyond traditional learning progressions by including multiple or alternative pathways students may develop content knowledge. Think of a learning map as a road map that shows students going to the same destination, but each one beginning his or her journeys from a different starting point. The map also shows the shortest, most direct way for each student to reach his or her destination. However, a good road map shows several alternate routes in case the main route cannot be taken. Learning maps are large, complex representations of how students develop academic knowledge and skills. Learning maps show connections between and among pieces of discrete knowledge, skills, and understandings called nodes. These maps represent potential pathways that students may follow to learn ELA and mathematics. The content within the learning maps is so vast that it needs to be broken down into manageable chunks. Claims, broad statements about what students are expected to learn and to do in relation to the content contained in ELA and mathematics. Conceptual areas, broad statements that tell what students should know and do in relation to a claim. Essential elements, EEs, describes what students should know and do in relation to a conceptual area and are aligned to the Missouri Learning Standards. Essential elements are embedded in the learning maps and are related to small clusters of nodes within the maps called mini-maps. The mini-map outlines all the skills necessary for a student to master a specific node. The mini-map has the nodes at all the linkage levels. We will talk more about linkage levels later in this webinar. Mini-maps also contain untested nodes. Untested nodes are skills that are important for a student to gain, but they are not tested for an essential element. Mini-maps can be helpful as you plan instruction to help a student to get to a specific skill. They allow you to see the skills the student must acquire to get to the skill you have identified the student needs in their IEP. Please take a few moments to look at this slide. All blueprints for ELA, math, and science are located on the DESE webpage under Resources. This is a screenshot of the blueprint on major claims and conceptual areas in ELA. Please look only at the front page. Notice it has 4 major claims and 9 conceptual areas. Remember, major claims are broad statements about what students are expected to learn and to do in relation to the content contained in the ELA and mathematics. Conceptual areas are broad statements that tell what students should know and do in relation to a claim. We will talk about how to use the entire blueprint later in the training. This is a screenshot of the essential elements for each conceptual area. Remember, we will discuss more about the blueprints later. The blueprints are at the target level. There will be a mini map for each of the essential elements that outline the academic steps to reach this skill. We will look at this on the next slide. We realize not all students with severe cognitive deficits will be able to work at this level. Students may be instructed and assessed at 3 levels below the target level in ELA and math. As you look at the progression of the initial, distal, and proximal levels, you can see how they support the development of target node. These are some of the steps you will find in the mini maps. You will need to get out the math blueprint and look only on page 1. Notice that math, like ELA, has 4 major claims and 9 conceptual areas. There are mini maps to go with each of the essential elements. Here is a screenshot of the major claims, concepts, and essential elements in math. Again, like ELA, there are mini maps that go along with each essential element in math. This is a screenshot that shows linkage levels for an essential element in Math Grade 3. Math and English Language Arts, ELA, are the same as far as the number of linkage levels and the way they are set up. The target is how the essential element will be written in the blueprints. You can teach and assess at whatever level provides an appropriate challenge for the student and represents a good instructional target. Page 2 of the blueprints for ELA and math tell how many essential elements need to be taught in what area. Make sure you pay attention to that. You want to choose the correct required elements, or those assessments will not count toward the blueprint requirements. For instance, if you look at page 8 of your math blueprints, it says to choose a minimum of 6 essential elements across a minimum of 3 claims. When you select your essential elements, make sure they come from claims 1, 2, and 4. You can teach and assess other essential elements, but you have to meet the blueprint requirements as provided. For each grade level page of the blueprints and on the instruction and assessment planner that we will talk about later in the presentation, it will outline what the requirements are for in each grade. You will want to pay close attention to those. The slide illustrates the issue of when teachers created plans and assessed students on optional high school math essential elements without realizing they do not count toward meeting blueprint requirements, despite the description stating that the essential elements below are available for instruction for your student. Although they do not count towards blueprint requirements, they may be beneficial for your student's educational goals. Notice that science does not have a learning map, and the structure for science is different than ELA and math. Science does not use major claims or conceptual areas. Instead, it uses domains, core areas, and topics. Science does have essential elements, just like ELA and math, that align to grade level standards. The DLM science assessment differs from the ELA and mathematics assessment also in a very important way. During the fall window, science essential elements are selected by the teacher in the instruction and assessment planner and are optional to test. The meeting blueprint requirements is not required. Any science testlets completed in the fall window are not to be used for accountability purposes. DESE strongly encourages teachers to instruct and assess on science essential elements in the fall window just as they would for ELA and mathematics. However, the spring assessments are required. During the spring window, the DLM system assigns the essential elements and linkage levels. This cannot be changed by the test administrator. Linkage levels are assigned based on the information you have provided about the student to the system. The testlets are assigned one at a time to the student until the blueprint is covered. Science testlets taken in the spring window are used for accountability purposes. Again, DESE strongly encourages all teachers to instruct on science essential elements during both windows. Locate your science blueprint and refer to page 1. What do you notice that is different from ELA or math? You should see that science has 3 domains, 10 core ideas, and 16 topics. More science core ideas and topics are continually being developed for future use. Here is a screenshot for elementary grades 3 through 5 and shows the relationship between the topics and EEs. Science uses grade spans and not specific grade levels. Please turn to page 2 in the science handout. Science is a grade span testlet that assumes students were exposed to instruction in earlier grades 3 and 4. Unlike ELA and math, science only has 3 linkage levels. The highest science linkage level is the target linkage level, and it is most aligned to the content of the grade level standard. The initial and precursor linkage levels are less complex than the target linkage level and provide access to the target linkage level at a reduced depth, breadth, and level of complexity. As you look at this specific essential element, you can see how the skill gets more involved as you move up linkage levels. Testlets at the initial linkage levels are typically intended for students who do not yet have symbolic communication. We will now begin Part 4, Instructionally Embedded Assessments. The Instructionally Embedded Alternate Assessment encourages this cyclical approach by giving teachers the opportunity to choose an essential element or elements and linkage levels, develop and deliver instruction for the chosen essential elements, and then assess the student when the teacher determines the student is ready. The instruction and assessment cycle begins with the selection of the EE, instruction, assess the student informally or via testlet, evaluate the results, and then provide more instruction if needed, then reassess and test. Here is a link to a video on the overview of instructionally embedded assessments. Pause the webinar and copy the link to your browser so you can view at a later time. Instructionally embedded assessments differ from the more traditional year-end testing where a student's knowledge is assessed for all subjects during a few weeks in the spring, resulting in an individual student score report. The primary intention of the instructionally embedded assessments is to connect instruction and assessment to a student's individual goals. It may be tempting to think the instruction-assessment relationship encourages teaching to the test, but it is actually the other way around. They encourage assessing a student on what the student was taught, using a cycle of instruction and assessment that gives students with the most significant cognitive disabilities opportunities to show what they know and can do. The testlets are used as a snapshot of what the student has learned through the teacher's rich instruction in order to provide insight as to whether a student needs continued instruction for a particular skill or concept or is ready for instruction on a new skill or concept. The instructionally embedded assessment is structured around the ELA and mathematics test blueprint requirements. Teachers make choices within the blueprint requirements based on each student's academic goals for instruction and assessment. Instructionally embedded assessments are administered in both a fall and spring window during the school year, as the assessment is intended to be integrated within classroom instruction. Both fall and spring assessments are incorporated into the student's overall performance toward their mastery of the alternate standard. The instructionally embedded alternate assessment allows teachers choice and flexibility for a student's instruction and assessment. The Instruction and Assessment Planner and Educator Portal, which we will discuss in greater detail later, will provide for each student the blueprint requirements for the subject and grade the essential elements and skills assessed at each linkage level and a recommended linkage level for a specific essential element. Within the options provided and the requirements for conceptual area coverage, educators should base essential elements, instruction, and assessment choices on a student's learning targets, grade level, and IEP goals. Teachers have the entire window to instruct and assess a student on the chosen essential elements to cover the blueprint. The assessment is delivered in testlets. Each testlet assesses one essential element at one linkage level except for writing. Instructionally embedded assessments are administered after the student has received instruction on an essential element or elements. Each student is assessed individually, even if in the same grade and classroom. Since not all students will have the same academic goals, have the same essential elements chosen, receive the same instruction, or progress at the same rate, the assessment is different for each student and delivered individually at the appropriate time. Instructionally embedded assessments should be administered throughout an assessment window. Students with the most significant cognitive disabilities are best able to demonstrate what they know and can do when a cyclical approach to their instruction, assessment, and evaluation is used, as opposed to being assessed at the end of the semester or school year on a mass of instruction they must recall from prior weeks and months. Instructionally embedded assessments can be used to identify a student's knowledge, skills, and understanding relative to the essential elements after receiving instruction. The student's progress report may be used at any time within the cycle to evaluate if additional instruction is needed or the student is ready to move on to another linkage level or essential element. Student learning is mapped throughout the year in Educator Portal for ELA and Math. The teacher may ask questions during the engagement activity. See Test Administrator Manual pages 59 through 61. Research indicates that teachers who activate a student's prior knowledge in a subject is more likely to re-engage and perform at a higher level. Engagement practices should be part of your instruction. For example, the story is about fishing. Ask, have you ever been fishing? What did you like or dislike about it? Continue asking questions. Remember, one testlet per essential element chosen in the instruction and assessment planner in ELA, Math, and Science has an engagement activity. Teacher can choose linkage level. System will choose and teacher can change if necessary. Each testlet is assigned separately. Test administrator schedules sessions within instructional testing window. There are 5 linkage levels for ELA and Math. These are Initial Precursor, Distal Precursor, Proximal Precursor, Target at the Essential Element level, Successor, getting closer to grade level standard. Science has only 3 linkage levels: Initial Precursor, Proximal Precursor, and Target. Remember that target level is mastery of a standard. However, it is at a reduced breadth, depth, and complexity of the Missouri learning standards. This chart shows a visual comparison in another way. A student new to Kite Suite is placed into the assessment at a linkage level based on information the examiner places in the first contact survey. Once the student engages in testlets, linkage levels are adjusted by the DLM system. The following slides will show examples of how the linkage levels look for the content levels. Remember, the test administrator can choose the linkage level as well. This is a screenshot of linkage levels for a grade 3 essential element in ELA. Remember, in the essential element, it is written at the target node, but you can choose at what level to teach and assess the essential element. Testlets at the initial precursor level are typically intended for students who do not yet have symbolic communication. Testlets at the distal and proximal precursor linkage levels allow students to develop knowledge, skills, and understanding to reach the target. Testlets at the successor linkage level give students the opportunity to take the next step beyond the expectations described by the essential element. This shows linkage levels for an EE in Math in Grade 3. Remember, there is a mini-map that is associated with each essential element that shows how students gain the knowledge and skills that help them achieve the target linkage level. This is an example of an essential element EE in middle school science. Notice there are only 3 linkage levels. The initial and precursor levels are less complex than the target linkage level and provide access to the target linkage level at a reduced depth, breadth, and level of complexity. Mini-maps for math and ELA have been refreshed with more in-depth information between initial precursor and distal precursor. This is a screenshot of the new mini-maps. Here is an example of a math relationship showing how both initial precursor and proximal precursor are related to the target. Here is an ELA example for 3rd grade. This illustrates the Missouri Learning Standards to the essential element as well as the linkage levels. This mini-map for ELA illustrates the initial precursor to the target as well as the proximal precursor to the target. This is an example of a mini-map that demonstrates how the various nodes of learning are related. Use the information from linkage levels and mini-maps for ELA and math and plan instruction and create IEP goals. Don't forget that each and every goal must have a short-term objective or benchmark. Check with your RPDC for training on developing standards-based IEPs using essential elements. This concludes Section 3. If you have additional questions, please contact your regional professional development consultant or special education director.